In October of 1967, Ernesto Che Guevara was captured in a Bolivian ravine after 11 months of a failed campaign. He was wounded, without medicine, and with a reduced group on the brink of collapse. In a matter of hours, his international figure was transformed into a defenseless prisoner under military custody. The Bolivian government, pressured by American advisors, ruled out a public trial or prolonged detention. The decision was immediate. He was to be executed. The order specified that the shots should avoid the face to support the version that he had died in combat. The next day, his body was displayed in the laundry room of a rural hospital, surrounded by military personnel, journalists, and doctors who certified the scene as irrefutable proof. How was the decision made to kill a wounded prisoner? Why was his body displayed as a trophy? What were they seeking to silence with that execution? The wandering guerrilla, a doctor-turned-fighter. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born in the Argentine city of Rosario in 1928. His family came from the educated middle class, with a background of economic stability that had eroded over the years. His father, named Ernesto, maintained liberal inclinations and a bohemian lifestyle. His mother, Celia de la Serna, represented a more conservative Catholic tradition. That combination of ideological influences created a home marked by the contrast between political openness and cultural rigidity. From childhood, asthma shaped his existence. The respiratory attacks were recurrent and forced the family to make practical decisions based on the child's health. The move to the province of Córdoba was prompted by the need to seek a milder climate. There, in a mountainous environment, the child grew up among medical treatments, inhalers, and episodes of crisis that accompanied him throughout his life. However, the illness did not lead him to inactivity. He participated in demanding sports like rugby, swam in rivers, rode through the hills on horseback, and trained in physical endurance. That determination to overcome biological limitation remained in the memory of his companions, who described him as a persevering young man. In 1947, he entered the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. The choice of career was partly linked to the personal experience with asthma. His studies were not limited to academic training. He became interested in philosophy, literature, and history, and expanded his library with classical and contemporary authors. The combination of scientific discipline and intellectual curiosity characterized his university years. In 1952, he embarked on a journey that would become a turning point. Accompanied by Alberto Granado, a biochemist with professional experience, he traveled across South America on a large-engine Norton motorcycle they called La Poderosa. They traversed Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, etching in Guevara's memory a mosaic of social realities. In Chile, the visit to the Chuquicamata copper mine allowed him to observe firsthand the working conditions. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company, an American capital company, controlled the exploitation. The miners lived in precarious camps, exposed to long working hours under conditions of extreme physical wear. That contrast between the exported wealth and the poverty of the workers remained as one of the most lasting impressions of the journey. In Peru, the contact with the citadel of Machu Picchu led to reflections on pre-Columbian civilizations. The monumentality of the constructions contrasted with the marginalization of contemporary indigenous peoples, forced to survive in poverty in nearby regions. That contradiction between glorious past and impoverished present became a point of analysis that Guevara would revisit in later writings. The journey included a stage at the San Pablo Leprosarium in the Peruvian Amazon. There, he collaborated as a medical student, attending to patients who lived isolated due to the stigma of leprosy. The experience confirmed that medical practice could acquire a broader social meaning linked not only to individual health but also to the integration of marginalized sectors. Back in Argentina, he completed his medical studies in 1953. He immediately organized a second trip, this time aimed at observing ongoing political processes. In Bolivia, he analyzed the impact of the recent revolution. In Peru and Ecuador, he made contact with social movements, and finally, he arrived in Guatemala. In that country, an agrarian reform was under development promoted by President Jacobo Arbenz. The project sought to redistribute unproductive lands for the benefit of the peasants, affecting the interests of the United Fruit Company, one of the most powerful foreign corporations in the region. Guevara associated with political circles and met Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist with extensive Marxist training. She introduced him to networks of Latin American militants and brought him closer to political literature that he had not yet explored in depth. The year 1954 was decisive in Guatemala. An operation organized by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States brought together mercenaries and military pressure against the government of Arbenz. The offensive included bombings and psychological maneuvers that quickly dismantled the Guatemalan army. Arbenz resigned and left the country. Guevara attempted to join the resistance, but the balance of forces made it impossible. The episode taught him that reform projects could be nullified by foreign intervention and that violence was an inevitable component of regional politics. After taking refuge in the Argentine embassy and leaving Guatemala, Guevara traveled to Mexico. There he joined communities of Latin American exiles, among them Cuban fighters who had participated in actions against the regime of Fulgencio Batista. He first met Raúl Castro, and shortly after Fidel Castro, who was planning a new armed expedition. The meeting between Fidel and Guevara turned out to be lengthy. Both shared visions about the continental situation. Castro identified in the Argentine a combination of academic preparation, political commitment, and willingness to sacrifice. Guevara, for his part, perceived in the Cuban leader a determination and organizational capacity. He decided to join the project without hesitation. In the following months, he received military training in Mexico. He learned weapon handling, unit organization, and guerrilla tactics. It was then that he received the nickname Chu, derived from the Argentine colloquial expression he used constantly. At the end of 1956, he embarked with 80 other fighters on the yacht Granma, bound for Cuba. The landing turned out unfavorably. The government forces ambushed the expedition members, and only a small group managed to retreat into the Sierra Maestra. Guevara survived and established himself as a combatant as well as a medic. His personal discipline, reinforced by years of dealing with asthma, allowed him to withstand extreme conditions. The ability to endure long marches and participate in combat even during respiratory crises distinguished him among his comrades. Over time, he assumed command of a guerrilla column. His responsibilities included organizing field hospitals, teaching peasants to read and write, and summary trials for enemy collaborators. In this last aspect, he was inflexible, authorizing executions when he deemed it necessary to preserve the cohesion of the movement. In December of 1958, he led the offensive against the city of Santa Clara. The battle defined the course of the war. Guevara managed to capture an armored train loaded with weapons and occupy strategic positions within the city. The victory accelerated the collapse of Batista's regime, which left the country on the 1st of January of 1959. The arrival in Havana marked a new stage. Guevara was appointed to institutional responsibilities. He supervised trials against former officials, led the National Bank, and held the Ministry of Industries. His development plans favored rapid industrialization and moral incentives over material ones. The result was a decrease in productivity and tensions with the inherited economic structure. On the international level, his stance distanced him from the Soviet Union. While Moscow promoted pragmatic exchange policies, Guevara advocated for positions of voluntary sacrifice and solidarity among Third World countries. His interventions at international conferences caused discomfort within the socialist bloc, which watched with concern the radical nature of his proposals. The doctor-turned-commander had achieved worldwide recognition, but at the same time was accumulating differences with the closest allies. His trajectory of wandering, begun in youthful travels across South America, found continuity in the search for new stages of struggle beyond the borders of Cuba. Destination Bolivia, the last revolutionary gamble. In 1965, Ernesto Guevara disappeared from Cuban public life. His last known intervention had taken place in Algiers during an international conference in which he harshly criticized the Soviet Union. He pointed out that Moscow's trading practices with Third World countries resembled those of economic imperialism. The accusation had an immediate echo. Soviet authorities accused him of ideological deviation, labeling him as a Trotskyist and Maoist, terms that represented serious offenses within the discipline of the socialist bloc. The return to Havana was marked by long meetings with Fidel Castro and other leaders. In meetings that lasted for hours, Guevara's departure from his official responsibilities was defined. In October of that year, Castro publicly read a resignation letter drafted by the Argentine. The text communicated his abandonment of all political and military positions, as well as his Cuban citizenship. In practice, it was a formal and definitive separation from power on the island. Far from retiring from revolutionary activity, Guevara tried to transfer his experience to other continents. In 1965, he led a military expedition to the Congo. There, he encountered insurmountable obstacles: divisions among local groups, the absence of military discipline, cultural complexity, and the lack of a plan adapted to African realities. The operation ended in failure. His return to Cuba found him in a deteriorated physical state, but it did not divert him from his goal of spreading the revolution throughout the world. In November of 1966, he embarked on a new mission, this time to Bolivia. The Cuban security services carefully planned his departure. Guevara underwent a physical transformation process aimed at erasing the features that made him recognizable. His head was partly shaved to simulate baldness, a dental prosthesis was fitted that altered his facial expression, and he wore thick-framed glasses. With altered shoes to change his height and without the characteristic beard, he became an irrelevant individual in the eyes of migration officials. He traveled with a false Uruguayan passport under the name Alfredo Gonzalez, entering the country without arousing suspicion. The selection of Bolivia was not accidental. Its geographical location in the center of the South American continent offered a point of irradiation towards Argentina, Chile, and Peru. The country exhibited high levels of poverty and had a majority peasant and indigenous population, sectors that Guevara considered prone to receive a message of revolutionary struggle. Additionally, the precedent of the Bolivian Revolution of 1952, which had redistributed lands and modified political structures, seemed to demonstrate the existence of a tradition of radical change. The decision to settle in Bolivia was coordinated with Fidel Castro, who supported the operation as part of Cuban foreign policy. The project aimed to keep alive the ideal of continental revolution and prevent the island's isolation in the region. In the initial planning, Guevara had the collaboration of the Bolivian Communist Party, led by Mario Monge, who had expressed his commitment to the insurgency. Upon arrival, expectations crumbled. The local communist leadership maintained a close relationship with Moscow and followed the guidelines of peaceful coexistence. From the Soviet perspective, fostering guerrillas in Latin America was a threat to negotiations with the United States. Monge demanded to personally lead the operation, a condition that Guevara rejected. The break was immediate and left the guerrilla without a political base in the country. The camp was established in the Nyancahuazu area within the department of Santa Cruz. It was a territory of irregular vegetation and with limited water sources. Although difficult to access, it offered no advantages for guerrilla warfare. It lacked a large peasant population and was under surveillance due to the presence of oil facilities in the region. The location proved unsuitable for the development of an insurgent nucleus. The initial contingent gathered around 50 combatants. The majority were Cuban veterans, accompanied by a small group of Argentinians, Peruvians, and later some foreigners like the Frenchman Régis Debray. Guevara had planned a gradual growth process with Bolivian additions, but that objective was never realized. The logistical difficulties manifested immediately. The food supply depended on sporadic shipments from Cuba and purchases in nearby towns, operations that raised suspicion among the local inhabitants. The land did not offer sufficient resources to sustain a group of that size. The lack of contacts in the cities, the absence of clandestine networks, and the peasant distrust further limited the possibility of maintaining a stable flow of provisions. The differences with the Cuban experience were noticeable. In the Sierra Maestra, the guerrilla movement had found support among poor peasants who suffered under the control of landowners. In Bolivia, after the agrarian reform of 1952, many peasants owned land and were wary of an uprising that could jeopardize their property. That structural factor minimized the support. The attempts to establish links with militants from neighboring countries were also thwarted. The planned contacts with groups in Argentina, Chile, and Peru were interrupted. The strategic isolation increased, leaving the guerrilla with no options for expansion. In the first months, the fighters focused on setting up the camp. They built trenches, dug underground hideouts for weapons and supplies, and practiced reconnaissance routes. Daily life was marked by the scarcity of resources and the growing tension between fighters of different nationalities. Guevara imposed strict discipline, similar to what he had maintained in Cuba, but the cultural and political differences between the Bolivians and the foreigners generated internal conflicts. Despite the training, the adverse environment limited the operations. The heat, the seasonal rains, and the difficulty of moving around the terrain made prolonged patrols challenging. The surveillance routines were exhausting, and morale began to deteriorate. Promises of reinforcements and political support had evaporated, revealing that the operation was being sustained in precarious conditions. The Bolivian expedition had been conceived as the seed of a regional revolution. Without local support, in an unpropitious territory with unstable supplies and growing internal frictions, the operation showed from the beginning signs of unviability that would become deeper with the passage of the months. The impossible campaign: hunger, isolation, and defeat. In February of 1967, Ernesto Guevara decided to initiate the first large-scale operation outside the Nyancahuazu base camp. He selected 25 combatants for a reconnaissance expedition toward the Rio Grande area. The objective was twofold: to explore the terrain in greater detail and to establish contacts with the peasant population. The march revealed from the onset the structural difficulties that would define the entire Bolivian campaign. The expedition lasted for weeks in conditions of great adversity. The guerrillas advanced through non-existent paths under heavy rains that turned streams into overflowing and dangerous currents. The mountainous terrain and dense vegetation slowed movement, imposing strenuous days that exhausted the group. The provisions were insufficient, and hunting in the region barely offered sustenance. During the crossing of a tributary of the Grande River, 3 men were swept away by the current and drowned. The guerrilla thus suffered its first casualties without having yet faced the army, which represented a significant moral blow. After 1 month of efforts, they returned to the camp without having managed to recruit peasants or establish local alliances. In March, 2 external figures joined that altered the group's dynamics. Régis Debray, a French intellectual with publications on the theory of guerrilla focus, arrived as a representative of European sectors interested in the experience. Alongside him joined Quiro Bustos, an Argentine painter linked to revolutionary organizations in his country. The presence of both generated cultural and political tensions. The Cuban veterans from the Sierra Maestra were distrustful of their intellectual profile and their limited military experience. For the local fighters, the arrival of foreigners added a sense of distance from the Bolivian reality. The internal situation worsened with the first defections. 2 Bolivian militants, Pastor Barrera and Honorato Rocabado, left the camp and surrendered to the authorities. They provided detailed information about the multinational composition of the group, its weaponry and patrol routines. They even pointed out the approximate location of Nyancahuazu from the air, accompanied by soldiers. These data were transmitted directly to President René Barrientos, who ordered the army to be deployed to the area and to maintain a state of maximum alert. On the 23rd of March, the first significant armed confrontation took place. An army company approached the insurgent area in a search operation. Guevara decided to respond from previously prepared defensive positions. The combat resulted in an unexpected success for the guerrillas, who inflicted casualties and captured prisoners, including mid-ranking officers. The spoils included modern weapons, ammunition, and communication equipment. The prisoners were released shortly after, in what Guevara presented as a propaganda gesture of a humanitarian nature. Nevertheless, the internal cost was high. Supplies were lost during the combat, and disciplinary sanctions arose against members who had shown nervousness under fire. The discipline imposed by Guevara became stricter after the confrontation. Punishments were applied, including the reduction of rations and restriction on access to certain weapons. This fueled tensions among the Bolivians, who perceived unequal treatment compared to the Cubans. The veterans of the Sierra Maestra, on the other hand, considered that the local fighters lacked the necessary discipline to sustain a prolonged military campaign. In April, Debray and Bustos left the camp with the mission to establish external links and seek logistical support. On the 20th of that month, they were detained in Muyupampa. During the interrogations, Debray confirmed the presence of Guevara in Bolivia. The information reached the military high command and the American advisors in the country. The capture had immediate international repercussions, as Debray was known in European university circles. The Bolivian government used his detention as evidence of foreign involvement in the insurgency. Bustos was accused of having provided drawings about the structure of the guerrilla group during his captivity. These diagrams, according to the official version, allowed the identification of combatants and revealed the internal organization. Years later, Bustos would argue that the drawings had a distracting purpose, but his defense did not dispel the suspicions of involuntary collaboration. On the 15th of April, the Cuban government indirectly strengthened the intelligence work of its adversaries. At a conference in Havana, recent photographs of Guevara without a beard were shown, and his writings that explicitly mentioned the possibility of a point in Bolivia were published. With this material, the Bolivian and United States authorities obtained definitive confirmation of his identity. The Central Intelligence Agency prepared reports that reached Washington, where President Lyndon Johnson received the first solid evidence of the Bolivian operation. From that moment, the military campaign in Bolivia had direct advice from United States Special Forces. Meanwhile, attempts to establish links with peasants proved unsuccessful. The inhabitants of the region showed distrust towards the insurgent group, influenced by rumors spread by the army that presented them as dangerous outsiders. Although some sold food, the majority preferred to inform the authorities about the guerrilla presence. The agrarian reform of 1952 had modified the rural structure, granting plots to numerous peasant families who now feared losing what they had achieved in the event of an armed conflict. This situation contrasted with what Guevara experienced in Cuba, where the landless peasants had constituted a social base for the guerrilla. The material conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Guevara's asthma attacks intensified in the humid environment, and the lack of adequate medication complicated his health. The food shortage forced the rations of meals to be extremely thin, with prolonged periods of semi-starvation. The group's morale was declining, especially among the Bolivian fighters, who questioned the rigidity of the Cuban command. The military encirclement grew ever tighter. Bolivian troops, reinforced with American advisors, employed systematic tracking techniques, forcing the guerrillas to move constantly. Each movement required a high expenditure of energy without providing strategic advantages. In July, they attempted to temporarily occupy Samaipata to obtain medicines and provisions. They managed to capture the local military post, but the medical supplies were insufficient and the necessary drugs to control Guevara's asthma were not found. By September, the guerrilla had been reduced to little more than 20 combatants in a state of exhaustion and illness. The casualties accumulated by combat, accidents, and ailments further weakened their resistance. The surviving group moved erratically, with a maneuvering space increasingly limited by the operations of the Bolivian armed forces. Without external reinforcements or a real possibility of expansion into neighboring countries, the campaign was in a critical situation, announcing an inevitable outcome: the siege and the fall, the trap in the Euro ravine. In the middle of 1967, the guerrilla led by Ernesto Guevara in Bolivia was in a critical state. Of that initial contingent, barely a core of little more than 20 combatants remained, exhausted, sick, and constantly moving through a territory increasingly monitored by the army. Hunger, progressive malnutrition, and the lack of medicine had severely weakened the resistance capacity. The movements, which were initially conceived as reconnaissance maneuvers, had become a necessity to escape a military encirclement that tightened day after day. Guevara's physical condition was deteriorating alarmingly. His asthma attacks were more frequent and prolonged, aggravated by the humidity of the subtropical climate and the constant effort of walking on mountainous terrain. The absence of bronchodilators turned each crisis into a direct threat to his survival. On more than one occasion, his companions improvised stretchers with branches and cloths to transport him for kilometers. Those transfers slowed down the group's march and exposed him to a greater risk of detection. Guevara, aware of the burden he represented, refused to reduce the pace of the campaign, insisting on staying active in the operations. In July, the need for medicine and provisions led the group to carry out a high-risk action against Samaipata in the department of Santa Cruz. For a few hours, they occupied the local military post and searched the town's pharmacy. However, the operation did not achieve the main objective. They did not find the specific drugs to control asthma nor durable provisions to ensure subsistence. The loot was meager compared to the risk taken. Furthermore, the action allowed the army to confirm the insurgents' operations area and further reinforce the encirclement. From then on, rural pharmacies and supply routes were under strict surveillance. The following months were of extreme deprivations. The fighters went through long periods without full meals, coming to subsist solely on roots, wild fruits, or small animals they managed to hunt sporadically. Malnutrition weakened muscles, reduced concentration ability, and made tactical coordination difficult. The physical exhaustion was also reflected in the collective mood. Morale decreased while tensions rose between the Cuban veterans and the Bolivian fighters, who demanded equal treatment in a context where survival depended on the strictest discipline. At the end of September, the group suffered an additional blow near Pucará. A military ambush ended the lives of two experienced guerrillas, known as Julio and Coco. Their loss was significant not only in human terms, but also due to the accumulated military experience that disappeared with them. Each casualty reduced the maneuverability of an already diminished group. The Bolivian army, with advice from the Central Intelligence Agency and the presence of instructors with experience in Vietnam, was perfecting tracking techniques. Helicopters flew over the region, patrols systematically combed the terrain, and the margin of rebel movement decreased more each day. By early October, the guerrilla had been reduced to a wandering group of just a few dozen fighters. Hunger and disease limited resistance, and strategic isolation prevented any possibility of reinforcement from neighboring countries. Faced with a lack of options, the insurgents sought support in rural communities, a measure that violated the security principles they had maintained for months. In the village of La Higuera, some villagers agreed to sell food and water, but the news of their presence quickly reached local authorities. That leak proved decisive. The military commanders organized a closing operation around the area, deploying units on all possible escape routes. Guevara then made the decision to head towards the Euro ravine. The gorge offered momentary refuge among the vegetation, but it represented a natural trap from which it was difficult to escape in case of siege. The choice of terrain, made under pressure and without prior reconnaissance, would mark the outcome of the campaign. On the 8th of October, shortly after dawn, the Bolivian troops surrounded the ravine. The peasants had provided sufficient details to guide the army to the exact position of the insurgent group. The deployment included soldiers on the heights and units advancing on the flanks. The numerical superiority and the tactical advantage were overwhelming. The confrontation began around mid-morning. The guerrillas tried to organize a defense from improvised positions, but the ravine limited any retreat maneuver. During the exchange of fire, Guevara was wounded in the right leg, possibly by shrapnel from projectiles that struck the rock. His carbine jammed and became unusable. With his pistol, he tried to continue, but the available ammunition depleted quickly. Surrounded by soldiers, he was left without tactical options. The military apprehended him along with other survivors. The surprise among the troops was immediate upon confirming his identity. It was not an anonymous combatant, but the internationalist leader whose image had appeared in intelligence reports for months. The news of the capture was immediately transmitted to La Paz, where President René Barrientos received confirmation of the military success. That same day, the prisoners were transferred under heavy custody to La Higuera. The village, with fewer than 100 inhabitants, did not have adequate infrastructure, but its isolation made it an ideal place to keep the detainee under control. The rural school was converted into a temporary prison. It was a simple adobe building with a single classroom, where Guevara was placed on a wooden bench, with his hands tied and guarded by armed soldiers. The transfer was carried out with extreme security measures. The military commanders were aware of the political and propaganda value of their prisoner. Guevara, although wounded, did not receive immediate medical attention. The soldiers kept constant guard, taking turns to avoid any oversight. During the journey, some tried to engage in conversation with him, driven by curiosity about the figure who had gained worldwide fame. The responses were brief, in a reserved tone, without visible signs of desperation. In the Bolivian capital, the confirmation of the capture opened an urgent debate. The authorities were evaluating 3 scenarios: transferring him to La Paz for a public trial, keeping him detained indefinitely in military facilities, or adopting a more radical solution. Each alternative involved risks. A trial would turn him into the center of international attention, prolonged detention would generate diplomatic pressure, and the final decision would have unpredictable political consequences. During the night from the 8th to the 9th of October, Guevara remained in custody at the school of La Higuera. He was interrogated by Bolivian officers who sought to confirm details of his identity and obtain operational information. Despite the exhaustion and the wound, he responded only as necessary, without offering information that would compromise his dispersed comrades or external contacts. Meanwhile, farmers from the area approached to observe discreetly. The small community, surprised by the military deployment, barely understood the significance of the detainee. However, the tension of the operation and the constant movement of troops made it clear that it was an exceptional prisoner. Communications between La Higuera and La Paz remained active throughout the night via military radio equipment. The encrypted messages conveyed reports on the detainee's situation and the area's security. The soldiers had strict orders to keep him alive until the High Command defined the final resolution. Surveillance was uninterrupted, with rotating guards and constant reports. In the capital, the debates unfolded under pressure. Keeping it alive entailed diplomatic complications and the risk of turning it into a symbol of resistance. Opting for a public trial exposed the government to global media attention and the possibility of demonstrations in different countries. The most drastic alternative eliminated those risks, but placed upon the authorities the historical responsibility of executing a prisoner whose name had already transcended the borders of Bolivia. In the early morning of the 9th of October, Guevara remained seated on the school bench under the dim light of kerosene lamps. His wound had not been treated and the exhaustion was evident, but he maintained a firm composure. He could not foresee what the final decision would be, but the course of events had reached a point where his personal fate was in the hands of a government that saw in him both a danger and a political opportunity. The silence of that night in La Higuera contrasted with the tension that was building up in the offices of La Paz. The prisoner, closely watched in an adobe classroom, found himself in the prelude to an outcome that, beyond the immediate, would define the way in which his figure would pass into contemporary history. The macabre execution, a corpse shown to the world. The morning of the 9th of October 1967 began with an unusual movement in the small town of La Higuera. Military helicopters landed nearby, transporting high-ranking officers, military doctors, and intelligence personnel. Among them was Felix Rodriguez, an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency of Cuban origin who had closely followed the operations from the Valle Grande base. His mission was to confirm the identity of the prisoner captured in the Quebrada del Euro and transmit the information directly to Washington. Rodriguez entered the rural school where Guevara was being held under strict surveillance. He carried archive photographs and had precise instructions. He had to verify physical traits, scars, and distinctive marks. For almost 1 hour he observed the prisoner meticulously, conversed with him in Spanish, and took notes for his report. The recognition left no doubts. The detainee was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna. Rodriguez transmitted the confirmation to his superiors through encrypted communication. The report reached the highest levels of the United States administration and was received as proof of the success of the military advisory strategy deployed in Bolivia. While this procedure was being developed, in La Paz, the deliberations about the fate of the prisoner continued. President René Barrientos was discussing with his cabinet and military leaders the possible outcomes. A public trial was quickly dismissed. The authorities feared it would become an international political platform and attract the world press on a scale unmanageable for the Bolivian state. The experience with the judicial process against Régis Debray had demonstrated the risk of generating international solidarity campaigns. With Guevara, the magnitude would be incomparable. The option of keeping him detained for a prolonged period was also not viable. The possibility of a rescue, an escape, or diplomatic pressure from Cuba's allied governments was being evaluated. Finally, the General Staff transmitted the final order at 11 o'clock in the morning. The prisoner was to be executed immediately. The instructions specified that the shots should not be directed at the head or face, with the aim of sustaining the official version that Guevara had died in combat. The responsibility fell on Sergeant Mario Terán, a non-commissioned officer in the Bolivian army. He accepted the mission, although he would later acknowledge the nervousness with which he received the assignment. He was given an automatic rifle and was briefed again on where to place the shots. Upon entering the classroom where the prisoner was sitting on a wooden bench, he experienced visible hesitations. Outside, witnesses noted that he remained for several minutes before carrying out the order, aware of the historical significance of his action. Around noon, the bursts were heard. Tehran fired at close range at the torso and limbs of the prisoner. The impacts were concentrated on the chest, abdomen, and legs. Guevara died in a few minutes, a victim of multiple gunshot wounds designed to simulate a recent combat. With this, the military operation that had begun 11 months earlier concluded, and the stage of political use of his corpse began. The body was prepared for the transfer to Valle Grande. A military helicopter carried it during the afternoon of the same day to the Señor de Malta hospital, which had been converted into a regional military base. There, the officers decided to organize a public exhibition to dispel any rumors about the supposed survival of the Argentine commander. The hospital's laundry, a simple space with cement walls, was set up as a temporary morgue. In that place, the body was placed on a cement sink with arms outstretched and the torso bare. The image surprised those who entered the room. Some journalists and doctors immediately commented on the similarity to religious representations of the descent of Christ. This visual association was reinforced with the photographs taken at the place, especially a frontal image in which the half-open eyes and the serene expression of the face evoked Christian iconographies. The news of the arrival of the body spread quickly. Soldiers, doctors, journalists, and residents of nearby villages paraded through the laundry room to observe it. The authorities sought a collective verification that would close any possibility of speculation. Every peasant who looked at the corpse reinforced the official narrative that Guevara had died. The photographers present took dozens of images from different angles. Some captured the face, others the wounds, and several documented the body's position in the pool. The frontal photograph became one of the most widely disseminated images of the decade, reproduced in newspapers and magazines worldwide. Its ambiguous nature, between forensic evidence and symbolic representation, helped to project the figure of the guerrilla beyond the initial propaganda intention. The exhibition continued during the 10th of October. Soldiers posed next to the corpse for photographic shots, some showing signs of triumph. Officers of different ranks paraded to observe the dead prisoner directly. The intention was clear: to offer indisputable proof that the threat had been eliminated. However, the visual effect transcended the governmental purpose and generated interpretations that escaped the control of the authorities. The decision to conduct a definitive identification led to an additional step. By order of the High Command, military doctors amputated both hands of the corpse. They were placed in jars with formalin and sent to La Paz for a fingerprint examination. The fingerprint comparisons confirmed with scientific precision the identity of the deceased. The procedure, executed with bureaucratic coldness, guaranteed the elimination of any future doubt, though it also added a macabre component to the narrative of the events. For several hours, the handless body remained exposed in the hospital laundry. Doctors, military personnel, and local onlookers continued to enter to observe it. The photographs taken during that period show not only the death of the commander, but also the manipulation of his corpse as a political instrument. The Bolivian army presented it as a war trophy, while for the Central Intelligence Agency, it constituted the material proof of the success of its counterinsurgency policy in Latin America. The transfer of the body, its placement in the laundry, the presence of national and international observers, the photographic images, and the mutilation for fingerprint tests were part of a strategy aimed at destroying the symbolic capacity of the man who had led the guerrilla. The objective was not only to physically eliminate the leader, but also to deactivate the possibility that his figure would continue to inspire new insurgencies. The conversion of the body into a spectacle sought to convey an unequivocal message. No attempt at armed revolution would go unpunished on the continent under the joint surveillance of local governments and foreign advisors. However, the immediate effect was not only what the authorities desired. The images circulated from Valle Grande took on a life of their own in the international press. The photograph of the body, compared to religious representations, was reproduced in European and Latin American media, creating an iconography that transcended the original intention to humiliate the defeated enemy. The physical death had been used as a demonstration of strength. but the images ended up feeding a symbolic projection that could not be controlled by those who had ordered the execution. From man to myth, the face that became legend. After the exhibition in Vallegrande, the body of Ernesto Guevara was secretly buried on the night of October 11, 1967. The operation was carried out under strict military guard, with a small group of officers who knew the exact location. He was placed in a mass grave near the local airstrip along with several of his guerrilla comrades. The decision to conceal the burial site was a political calculation, to prevent the grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for militants or sympathizers. The secret was classified as national security information, and only a few high-ranking commanders knew the details. For 3 decades, that silence was maintained. The officers involved, some retired over the years, were instructed never to reveal the whereabouts, not even after leaving active service. Thus, the exact location of the body remained an enigma for 30 years, fueling rumors and speculation in political, academic, and activist circles around the world. In 1995, a retired general from the Bolivian army publicly declared having participated in the clandestine burial. The confession triggered an international process. Forensic experts from Cuba, Bolivia, and other countries began excavations in the areas indicated by military testimonies. Between 1996 and 1997, specialized teams worked at different points in Vallegrande with archaeological methods and stratigraphic analysis. The maps were imprecise and the accounts contradicted each other, but after months of systematic surveys, human remains were located that matched Guevara's physical characteristics. The discovery occurred in July of 1997. The remains showed evidence of the post-mortem amputations ordered in 1967, which reinforced the hypothesis that it was the Argentine commander. The identification was confirmed through forensic dentistry analysis, comparisons of previous medical records, and genetic studies that were later conducted with samples from relatives. The official announcement by the Bolivian government on the 12th of July of that year closed 3 decades of uncertainty. The news had an immediate worldwide impact. The Cuban government organized the repatriation with state honors. A military plane transported the remains from Bolivia to the island, accompanied by relatives of guerrillas killed in the same campaign. In Cuba, official ceremonies were programmed that included mass events and the direct participation of Fidel Castro. The funerals took place in Santa Clara, a symbolic city for having been the scene of Guevara's decisive victory in December 1958. There, a mausoleum was erected with a large bronze statue, a museum with documents, weapons, and photographs in addition to an eternal flame. The monumental complex became a mandatory destination for political pilgrimage. Every 8th of October, commemorations are organized and thousands of students visit the place in school events where revolutionary slogans are reaffirmed. However, the construction of the myth had begun long before the discovery. In March of 1960, the photographer Alberto Corda captured in Havana an image of Guevara during a funeral for victims of the explosion of the ship La Coubre. The portrait showed the guerrilla with a beret, beard, and a firm gaze towards the horizon. For years it circulated in left-wing media and militant publications, but its massive spread occurred after the death in Bolivia. From 1968, photography was adopted by student movements in Europe and the United States as a symbol of rebellion. In Paris, during the May protests, its image appeared on banners and murals. In American universities, it became a youth emblem against the Vietnam War and the traditional political system. Reproduction increased when Andy Warhol adapted the image with his screen printing technique, applying bright colors that transformed the guerrilla into a pop icon comparable to Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley. That artistic appropriation facilitated the transition from political symbol to commercial product. During the following decades, Corda's photograph appeared on T-shirts, posters, mugs, flags, backpacks, and all kinds of items. The contradiction was evident. The revolutionary who had rejected material incentives became a profitable brand in the global market. Fashion and advertising companies used his face to sell everything from drinks to youth consumer products. The phenomenon acquired global dimensions. In student demonstrations in cities like Berlin, London, Buenos Aires, or Santiago, the face of Che remained present as a banner of nonconformity. Simultaneously, tourists acquired in Havana T-shirts and souvenirs with his image in state markets. generating income for a system that he himself had tried to organize on anti-capitalist bases. The distance between the historical figure and the commercial icon widened over the years. Guevara had been a leader with rigid ideas, responsible for summary executions and failed economic policies in revolutionary Cuba. He had shown a willingness to use violence as a political method and upheld an uncompromising view of armed struggle. The mythification, on the other hand, reduced him to a heroic figure without contradictions. The complexity of his trajectory was overshadowed by the power of a simplified image. For the Cuban government, that simplification was functional. The slogan, "We will be like Che," was integrated into primary and secondary education as part of official indoctrination. The figure of the fallen guerrilla became an example of absolute sacrifice in the service of the revolution. The difference between the real man and the political icon was erased in the official narrative, which exalted his dedication without questioning the tensions he had maintained with the Cuban leadership during his lifetime. The myth also worked in different contexts. For youth groups in Europe, his image represented generic opposition to power structures. For Latin American movements, it meant resistance to imperialism and local elites. For millions of consumers, however, it was nothing more than an attractive logo detached from any ideological commitment. In that crossroads between political symbol and capitalist commodity, Guevara's figure acquired an unprecedented ubiquity. The paradox became evident during the final decades of the 20th century. At the same time as his mausoleum in Santa Clara was solidifying as a space of official political cult, his face was circulating in international markets as a youth fashion print. The clandestine burial that had attempted to erase his memory ended up being the beginning of a process of mythical construction that reached global dimensions. The cycle was completed with the exhumation in 1997 and the monumentalization in Cuba, which provided material support to the myth. The physical death concealed in a common grave resulted in a universal symbolic presence. In a world where images circulated more forcefully than biographies, the face captured by Corda defined the character more than his actual trajectory. The figure of Ernesto Guevara, transformed into a myth, continues to generate opposing interpretations. For some, he is an emblem of social justice. For others, an empty icon of youthful rebellion. For many, a logo reproduced without reflection on its meaning. The truth is that the image, expanded to saturation, survives the historical contexts that gave it origin. The guerrilla fighter killed in Bolivia ended up becoming one of the most recognizable effigies of the 20th century, with a symbolic influence that persists to the present day.